In this lecture, we are going to introduce distillation, which at its most basic form is the process of taking our fermented alcoholic liquid, usually, and at this level, we're only talking about liquids, and concentrating the alcohol in the liquid, raising the alcohol by volume or ABV. We'll talk about what happens inside a still and discuss a couple of types of stills used in spirit creation. So, distillation is where we diverge from natural processes often involved in fermentation. Nature can be wholly or partly responsible in our processes so far, but distillation involves the application of science and man made tools. Fermentation happens everywhere all the time, regardless of what we humans want sometimes. In distillation, we'll be concentrating the ethanol in the fermented liquid and we'll be separating it multiple times into groups of fractions or groups of chemical compounds that have similarity with regard to their volatility. By volatility, we are referring to when these compounds enter their gaseous state. Distillation is the art and science of manipulating these liquid and gaseous states of the various fractions in a way that gives us a liquid at the end that we would want to sell or consume. Much of the flavor development has already happened, and our congeners, aromas and flavors, are there inside our alcoholic liquid and may be concentrated or removed through the distillation process, as well as possibly being altered during this process. Now, this complex and seemingly complicated process of grouping our volatile fractions together can be very confusing. But at its core, it's a single concept that's maybe happening once or maybe 50 times over and over. We are all familiar with a pot of water boiling and the notion of water as a liquid becoming a vapor and rising as steam from a pot. So, if we are at sea level and bring pure water to 100 degrees, it will begin to boil, and we will see bubbles of gaseous water form at the bottom of the pan where the heat is coming through and then escaping the liquid as vapor. Now, imagine this was a pot of ethanol. We'd start to see the same thing happen, but at 78.3 degrees. So, ethanol is more volatile than water. So, say we have an alcoholic liquid in our pot that is about 10% ethanol. So, in the range of our fermented alcoholic liquids we've been creating earlier in this process. Since ethanol is more volatile, it's going to vaporize or go to gas sooner than the water. So, this steam will have more ethanol in it than the liquid in the pot, right? The liquid is going to continually have less ethanol or a lower ABV with time. We might see the ethanol level in the steam at about 50% ABV rather than the 10% down in the liquid. What we don't have is a clean, exact separation. The ethanol molecules don't just leave the water molecules behind in solution. It's much messier than that. The steam that you can see are tiny droplets of liquid commingling with gases in a vapor. But this higher ABV is what we are after. So now we have to get that ethanol out of the steam. That happens with condensation. By cooling the vapors back to beneath their boiling points, they return to their liquid states. But now that liquid has a higher ABV than the liquid we started with. So imagine we put our newly collected liquid in a pot and apply heat again. At a certain temperature, lower than what we needed before, we're going to get vapors or steam arising from the liquid. Condense this vapor, and you have a liquid with yet higher ABV. All right, this brings us to the concepts of reflux and rectification, which is a means to deal with that messiness that I mentioned earlier. Let's go back to our steam coming off of our cooking pot and just look closer at these vapors. Also, initially imagine for this example that we only have pure water and pure ethanol in this liquid. The ABV of the liquid or the steam isn't important, but what is happening inside the steam is that liquids and gases are bouncing around, and the more volatile ones are rising and the less volatile ones are falling. If a part of the steam cools, we'll have condensation happen, and then that liquid will try to fall back into the pot. So when these gases are bouncing around and crashing into these droplets, they combine and then separate again. Both get changed in this process. This is the process we're going to call reflux. Reflux is the interaction of these gases and liquids inside a still. The result of this interaction, of them crashing into each other, is that we still have gases and liquid droplets coming out of the crash, but the gases after the collision will be slightly higher ABV, and the droplets, the closer to liquid portions, will be slightly lower in ABV. We could also say that the gases are now higher in volatility and the droplets lower in volatility after the collision. It's sort of like the ethanol trapped in the droplet wants to be a gas because of the ambient heat. So this crash lets it hook up with other vaporized ethanol molecules. The ethanol rises and the water droplets sink. But again, it's not exact. There's still some water molecules as a gas hanging around with those ethanol molecules, and there are still some ethanol molecules in our liquid droplets. So this crash is happening all over the place with higher up collisions representing higher ABV sections of the vapor. So our vapor here isn't a constant composition throughout. It's different near the surface of the hot liquid compared to at the higher levels farther away from the heat source. Our highly volatile gases are concentrating higher up, and our lower volatility components are down nearer to the heat source. If you were to collect this vapor at different levels, it would have different compositions and different ABVs accordingly. The term rectification is the name of this increase in AB through reflux. A highly rectified spirit is one where lots of refluxes happened, producing liquids with a higher ABV, and lower rectification aligns with a lower ABV. So if our goal was ethanol and other volatile alcohols, this high rectification is the way to go. Nothing much else is going to hit that way at the top in the condensation stage except the most volatile compounds. Our highly rectified spirits will have less flavor intensity, except flavors from those highly volatile compounds. And our less rectified spirits will have more stuff in that vapor. Stuff meaning congeners that can taste desirable or stuff that can taste nasty. Another concept to start to grasp here is that you can increase the amount of reflux by forcing more of those collisions. Imagine if your still isn't a perfect cone, but has all sorts of shape deformations that can create eddies or force the vapors to seek out a convoluted path to escape. Imagine if your still is just simmering rather than boiling. Imagine if your still barely has any liquid in it to begin with. All of these and more can affect that reflux. Now, now add 1,000 more compounds besides ethanol and water that all have different volatility levels. And reflux is now doing more than just separating ethanol and water, but is putting different fractions, complete with different congeners, at these myriad of ABV levels inside the vapor. So these concepts of reflux and rectification are very important to grasp and are vital for us as distillers in creating our desired style of spirit. So that would make sense that the shape and the type of still can greatly affect our reflux and rectification. At this level, we're going to look at two broad types of stills, our pot stills and column stills. And at the risk of offending everyone, there are some generalizations that can be made regarding these two types of stills. Pot stills are run one batch at a time, and they tend to create spirits with lower ABV and more character through allowing larger groups of fractions to make it through the distillation process. Maybe good character, maybe not. And our column stills can be run continuously, and they can create spirits with very high ABV, although those high ABV levels do not tend to have high character, at least desirable character. There are stills that are a blend of these, like a hybrid still, and then we have some other stills used around the world, often for specialty regional spirits that we're not going to cover at this level. Like here is a hybrid still with the ability to choose which you want to use with each run. At the left is a pot, and then that can be led into a column or two. And then we have earthen pot stills used in mezcal production, and then baijiu stills where the contents are not liquid but have a steam injection process through it. But again, we'll cover those in later talks. Suffice to say, there are some cool stills that are being created each year and others that have stood the test of time. But we're going to look deeper at those two primary types, which should really help you better understand all of the others and any more that you might come across. They can seem very complicated at first glance, but as you begin to understand how we are just applying what we just covered, you'll begin to understand that it's not that complicated. All stills are basically doing the same thing, concentrating desired alcohols, choosing which fractions to retain and which to remove. All stills do have a way to cool the vapors, that condensation process we mentioned earlier. Now, you may never see a still like this in person, but we can see that the still here in the foreground, the vapors then head up over to that big tank in the back. And then after being cooled back into a liquid, they're coming out into these metal containers. The equipment used to condense the vapors are called condensers. And we'll discuss the different types of condensers as we explore the still types. Okay, our first still type is the pot still, and here's how they work. We have our fermented alcoholic liquid, or maybe a previously distilled alcoholic liquid, in the bottom. We then heat the liquid, either from the outside or from steam coils on the inside. Our vapors start to rise again, and reflux happens. Liquids are falling back down to boil again, gases are getting more volatile towards the top, and then they escape to a condenser where they cool and turn back into a liquid. That liquid has higher ABV than at the start of the process. We clean out the leftover goo in the pot, which is hopefully mostly free of ethanol, and we do it again. Now, if this is our first pot distillation, we might have 10% ABV at the start, and then our higher ABV coming out might be around 25 to 30% ABV. Our second run, using that as the base, gets us to 75% or 150 proof, which is now a spirit. This is an ABV we could theoretically sell. However, this simple distillation shown here is really only how the first distillation is done. Remember our notion of reflux and fractions? Also remember we have groups of chemical compounds with differing volatility levels in groups. While we end up with a liquid at that after the condenser at 30% ABV, when this liquid first warms up, we're seeing vapors or groups of fractions heading over to the condenser at, say, 50% ABV. And then towards the end of the distillation, when this liquid is coming out of the condenser down near 1 to 2% ABV. What's left over has almost no alcohol left in it, and our average is what gets us to that 25 to 30% ABV. We don't just stop the process earlier because we don't want to leave ethanol behind. We worked hard for it. There may also be congeners or flavors that only make it over in the less volatile fractions, or those happening in the later stages of this distillation. It's very important to understand this fraction concept as we usually start to really play with them in our second distillation. Now we're going to discuss how we use those fractions in our second pot still distillation. A group of fractions is called a cut, and the point in time where we choose to collect different groups of fractions is called the cut. So cutting refers to when we choose to separate fractions from being collected. Not all spirit production or even pot still distillation treats cuts the same way or does cuts in the same manner. This is primarily how it's done in Scotch malt whiskey production and in a number of other countries and styles. We'll have our first distilled batch at 25 to 30%, which are called our low wines. That's the name of our first distillation product. And now that goes into the still and is heated again. Remember that our first fractions that come off are the most volatile ones. These are grouped into what we call our group 1 fractions. We have ethanol coming over, but we also have some poisonous alcohols that smell like solvents because they might be solvents like acetone, and poisonous methanol will come over here as well. We decide we don't want these. So when they come off, and again, they are coming off first as our most volatile fractions or our group 1 fractions. When we decide that we have all of these fractions collected, we make a cut, and these are referred to as the heads. These heads are not going into our finished product. At this point, we are now taking what we'll call our group 2 fractions. These will be collected. So again, a cut divides our fraction groups. So we now have our group 2 fractions that are coming off the still, and these are sometimes called the heart or heart cut. This is our fraction with a high percentage of ethanol, and those fractions that have similar boiling points to ethanol. We are keeping this part to sell or possibly distill again in a third distillation, but this is the goal of our second distillation. Eventually, our lower volatility fractions start to appear, and we make another cut and divert these group 3 fractions or our tails into another vessel. These can often have a cheesier, plasticky aroma to them. But there's still some ethanol that is hanging out in the group threes as well as the group ones or the heads. So often what we do is we run these group one and threes back through a second distillation again in our next batch. So those low wines are then combined with our heads and tails, or group one and three, and redistilled. What was left over in the still is thrown out as waste. It's important to know that these groups and their delineation, or where cuts happen, is not set in stone. Where group one ends and group two begins is a choice. Sometimes the desired style dictates where the fractions are grouped. Sometimes it's economics. If you're making an affordable spirit, you have to stretch the volume of your group two or heart cuts so you have more liquid to sell from this batch distillation. And some producers further delineate their group two fractions. This is done in cognac, for instance. And I know of a tequila producer who bottles and sells the heart of the heart, or a subset of the group two fractions, for twice what he sells the product from the surrounding fractions, still group two, that are up against the group one and group three segments. Despite the ability to make these multiple cuts by desired fractions, pot stills still don't have the ability to really isolate fractions. We still end up with compounds that should be only in our group three that made it into our group one. So that's why we're throwing those back in again to distill in hopes we get them where they belong. However, if we do this second distillation carefully, with temperatures just right, and maybe do some still modifications to crank up our reflux, this fractional diversity gives us the potential for certain congener fractions, think flavors, to be captured in that group 2 mix. This is how the notion of increased potential character with pot stills exists. However, if we are wanting pure ethanol at high ABV, we just can't get pure alcohol out of these pot stills. Not only that, remember that what is coming off the still changes by the minute. And also, from a logistical standpoint, after every batch we do with this type of still, we have to clean it out. And there's almost always going to be some residue left over from our group three fractions at the end of the run that are going to be mixed in with the first group ones when we fire it back up again. So we have a lot of time and labor wrapped up in this batch distillation method. What if we could invent some crazy apparatus that would carve up these fractions into more than just our three groups and keep them apart so we could get that ethanol to about 100% pure and just have the thing run all the time at a consistent temperature? Well, eventually the technology arose to do just that with continuously run stills that are called column stills. We've seen how multiple distillations are used to increase the ABV of our fermented liquid. And we almost always have to do two distillations at least to get up to an actual spirit ABV. Now, we've been doing batch distillation for centuries around the world, and all the batch systems have those same restraints. They can't make pure or nearly pure ethanol, which we'd love to have for flexibility and economics. Let's not waste any of the potential alcohol if possible. From a business standpoint, how could we streamline this process and increase efficiency? Yes, we could use a pot still 20 times over and over again, but the labor and cost is crazy, and we still won't get to our pure alcohol. Think back to our vapors coming off of our cooking pot. As our understanding of molecular science and chemistry grows, we know that each vertical segment in this vapor will tend to have different ABVs. If we could isolate each layer and have a way to kind of clean up each layer too, we might be onto something. So what we do is we make a column separated with a number of plates, maybe 5, maybe 50. And on each of these blue plates inside the column, we're going to have a little distillation happen. Or maybe it's easier to think of it as a bunch of reflux, that process of gases and vapors smashing together. And the gases and vapors that result from the collision are slightly different in composition. The gases get a little more volatile, and the liquid gets a little less volatile. So here's our plate in blue, and it has a hole in it where the pink vapors can come up through. They are forced into the liquid, or the white level here, and through reflux, we have that change. And the gases that are more volatile head up to the next plate, and the liquids that are getting less volatile head down to the plate below. Here's what one of those small plates would look like, for instance. You can see the three caps that will force the vapor out of the little holes where liquid would be close to the level of that drain. That drain's called the downcomer, as that's where liquid would head back to the plate below. So if we can get things balanced just right with a warm liquid coming in at a plate that's just as close to that temperature as possible, and then we pull liquids out at the same volume, we end up with a system in stasis. What we've actually done with this device is just do a much better job of isolating our separate fractions. A group 3 fraction that may have been mixed into our group 2 fraction or group 1 fraction in our second pot distillation is going to have a really hard time making it to the top of this thing. So our 10% fermented alcoholic liquid is heated and introduced to the still, and each of these plates is causing reflux. And we are again creating many groups of fractions separated on each level. Our heads, or group ones, come out of the top where you'd expect. Somewhere beneath that, we have our group two, or hearts, being pulled off. By isolation with a lot of plates, we can get a fraction with almost pure ethanol, like 96% ABV. And this tight ethanol fraction is not going to have many congeners. In other words, it's not going to taste like much besides ethanol. And it will be referred to as a neutral spirit. If we can get to 96% ABV in the EU or 95% in the US, that's classified as a neutral spirit. Then lower on, we pull our group 3 or our tails off, and then we have waste coming out as well. Below this group 3, fraction removal, the still is very hot and basically acting like that first pot distillation. Just for a minute, imagine we were running a pure water and ethanol mix through this process. The waste would be pure water, and the group 1 would be pure ethanol. Now, we could choose exactly where we pull our group 2 out to get a 75% ABV or 61.25% ABV or whatever. This is important to understand because maybe we don't want pure ethanol. We don't drink Everclear anymore, at least not since college. We can pull our ethanol out at, say, 60%, and we'll have other fractions in there besides ethanol, and thus have the potential for some character. Now, maybe our goals or even legal constraints for certain products say we can't use a still with 40 plates, and we can have only, say, 5 plates in our column. Simply said, the fewer the plates in use, the greater number of fractions and potential congeners are going to be present at each plate. So our Armagnac and rum agricole can come out from a column still at fairly high ABV, not in the 90s, but still have noticeable character, and some would argue in common with those created by a second distillation in a pot still. And like pots, we're usually running these through a condenser, but we don't have to. Often for efficiency, we reuse the heat pulled out during condensation to heat the liquid going back in. What we really want to be able to do is feed this still at the perfect rate and at the perfect temperature so we can keep it going. All input volumes, their makeup, the temperatures are identical all the time because if anything changes, the makeup of these plates is going to change too, and our consistency is now lost. Now, for this level, we're not going to go deeper, but there are many modifications that are made to these stills, and often they are broken into sections so they don't punch through the ceiling. And in some applications, you can take these highly rectified hearts and blend water back in and distill again for additional purity. So even though we only covered 2 types of stills and presented only an overview, we did cover a lot. But hopefully you understand a bit more about distillation. Specifically, what is happening to our fermented alcoholic liquid as an input and what the outputs are as in a higher ABV liquid, now called a spirit. The concepts of fractions, groups of fractions, and congeners should now be pretty well understood. You should also understand now what rectification means and what reflux is and how they play with each other. Also, you should recognize what a pot still is, what defines batch distillation, and the benefits and challenges of pot distillation. And then the same ideas with regard to column stills, how they work, and why a distiller would choose to use one or the other.